Hey, folks, the best way to describe my guest today is every man because he has done everything in the world of professional wrestling. He's been a referee, a wrestler, a manager, an agent, an executive, a two-time Hall of Famer. See what I mean? He's done everything. Oh, and I should mention he's an original member of the Four Horsemen. Welcome, J.J. Dillon. Hello, J.J.
Hey, wow, that was a very nice introduction. Thank you very much.
Well, it
Sometimes
barely
I forget.
covers it. It barely covers
I,
it. Are you kidding me? All you've
well,
done?
yeah. I mean, I'm at this stage of my life where I look back and I, I just know that it's been a great career for me, but I also recognize that the reason I had any level of success was because I met good people along the way, and they all embraced me and helped me. And now I sometimes pinch myself when I look that I've got two Hall of Fame rings, and
Yeah.
and just as a 16-year-old kid in New Jersey, I fell in love with professional wrestling back. I mean, I'm going back to Antonino Rocca, and then Buddy Rogers and Bob Orton, and
Jeez.
just dreamed that someday, maybe that this could happen for me, and just good fortune along the way. And all of a sudden, like I say, all these years later, I look back and but I had a lot of help along the way. I really did. I was never the biggest, never the best, but nobody loved the business more than I did and was willing to work any harder than I was. And so I was rewarded for all of that.
Well, I think you said so many people helped you along the way, and because they wanted to. You were somebody who had absolute respect, not just for the business, but for them, the people you respected, and they returned it in kind many, many times. I want to talk about that and the incredible wrestling career, just so many different things you did. But I go back to the beginning here, and when I say what Trenton makes, the world takes.
Wow, that's right on the side of the bridge crossing the Delaware River. Trenton
That's
makes the
right.
world takes.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, and I have a really good friend who is from there and would often remind me of that. Now, you're going to love this, JJ, because, like I said, you were an everyman, but maybe I should have described you as a utility player because I know one of your first loves was baseball. And my first
Still
job.
is.
Huh?
Still is. But
Yeah,
I
back
I
then.
fell in love with the Brooklyn Dodgers,
Yeah.
and in 1958, when the Dodgers uprooted and moved to California, and the Giants followed them, and the only ones that stayed here were the Yankees.
Yeah.
And back in those days, this was before the internet. It was before cable television, of course. So I used to get up and get the morning paper, and because of the print deadline, because they were now based in the West Coast, it would only have the line score to about the third inning.
Yeah.
So it was hard to keep up the passion that I had for my Dodgers, and I think everything in life probably happens for a reason, and so that's what caused my interest is to swing to the world of professional wrestling, which has worked out well, and but I still have that passion for baseball.
Yeah. Well, and my first job was with Major League Baseball Productions. That's how I ended up back east because I did grow up out in Arizona and just things happen. That's a long story, but I ended up back there working for Major League Baseball Productions and had the opportunity. We used to do This Week in Baseball, and I would log baseball games all day long. And of course, that was the big show was Mel Allen. But
Yep.
at the end of the year, we would do highlight films for all the teams. We did all 26 at the time, all those teams. And I had the great fortune to work. I did 4 Dodger highlight films when I eventually became a producer. So I did 4 Dodger highlight films and got to do the 25-year history film. And so I had the chance. I got to meet all of these original Dodgers. Duke Snider, I know you're a fan of.
Yes.
All these, and I'm telling you, that was such an incredible period of time in baseball history because you talk about the Giants, they were there, and then you
Yep.
had the Dodgers, and of course they all moved west. But what a time! And I don't know if you ever had the opportunity to go to any of those games when you were a kid, but I just
I my My parents took me because we used to watch the Dodgers on Channel 9 out of New York, and Happy Felton's Knot Hole Gang. And I think my parents, everything that I've been involved in, whether it was wrestling or the love for the Dodgers before, my parents probably thought, well, I'll my taste will change, I'll outgrow, but they never did. And I had a chance to go, like I say, they took me one time to Ebbets Field. I just remember sitting up in the section behind the dugout on the third base side, and I have this memory of Warren Spahn with that big hook nose and that high kick warming up in the bullpen, and that's the only recollection I have of that day. But I went to one game in Ebbets Field, and then the other thing was my wife. We're now divorced, but my third wife gave me a present of a week for Dodger fantasy camp in Vero Beach.
Really?
Yeah.
Down in Florida?
Down in Florida.
Yeah.
And so,
Dodger
again, Duke Snyder was my idol. And so now I'm in the batting cage, and there's Duke Snyder, leaning against the thing, critiquing and it's like I had to just step out and pinch myself that here's my childhood idol standing here. And it was Carl Erskine was there, who was Clem Labine, a lot of the old time Dodgers, and what made their fantasy camp different from all the others was that you actually lived in Dodger Town in Vero Beach. And they had like 2 to a room, and the Phillies had one, and some of the other teams had them, but they would house you in a hotel, and you would go to the practice ground. But the one in Vero Beach with the Dodgers, you had your meals and everything there, and it was an incredible experience for me.
Yeah, and just amazing, because we would go down and cover spring training, and God, Sandy Koufax was there. But anyway, I get off track here, but I just love every once in a while I run into somebody that could appreciate that history. And being where you are growing up was awesome.
The last day, the thing ended like on a Wednesday, and so we went to a local restaurant. My wife and my kids were real young, stayed in a hotel because you actually lived in, housed where the players were housed, and of course you see your family. And so the last night we went to a restaurant for dinner, and as we're walking in the front door for dinner, the door opens and out steps Sandy Koufax leaving. And so it was like, wow, and Campanella was still alive. It just for somebody that was a Brooklyn Dodger fan, and to be able to go there, it was like a dream come true for a kid. It really was.
Yeah, and I also got to work on I did a highlight film with the '61 Yankees, and I actually have the poster in my office here. It was called Pinstripe Power, and we got to go around the country, JJ, interviewing all these guys that were on that team that were still around, and oh God, it was just an experience. But we'll share that over a beer sometime. I'm going to run into you sometime, and I'll tell you more of the stories. But I wanted to get back to your.
I worked for Vince McMahon, and got to know and met John Filippelli, who is now the president of the Yes Network.
Yep.
And became good friends with he and his wife Jenna, and so one time he took me down to Yankee, took me to Yankee Stadium, and back in the clubhouse, and there's I can't remember what the thing was, a plate at the end of the dugout, and back in this what looked to be very small locker rooms. You think, oh boy, Yankees, but of course the modern stadiums are all built different. But it just was a magical time for me, and meeting my childhood heroes.
Yeah, you go in those houses, man. Yankee Stadium back then, Fenway, yeah. So it really is quite an experience. But I want to get back
I went to Fenway too. Just Greg Oliver, who was Bret Hart introduced me to Greg Oliver, who was at that point, I think, a third base coach for the Red Sox. And so when I was in Boston, he had me come over, take a cab in the morning over to Fenway. And again, I got the whole tour there and walked out on the field, out to the Green Monster, where you look at it and it looked like somebody had taken a ball peen hammer and just tap, 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 tap. There was all these dents all over it. And then you open the door and you look underneath and there's all of this scaffolding. And everywhere you look, somebody has taken a Sharpie and signed their name, and I found an open spot. So my signature's under there somewhere. I can't imagine that they ever paint over any of them. And just, again, a dream come true for me.
Yeah, just incredible history. Look at us, JJ. We're like two little kids talking these stories.
Yeah.
It's the truth, man. I have fond memories. That's like a whole other part of my life. I don't know why we never chatted about this when we worked together, when we were at the WWF, because I would have had a lot of great stories to tell you, and someday we will. We're going to share those. But I know folks listening want to hear us talk about your career along the way, because you mentioned so many different things that you did. And, and going through it, and I'm looking at, like in your book, it's almost like you got on a train that, and I don't want to say you wanted to get off, but couldn't get off. It just kind of went in all these different directions. These opportunities came along, and one was better than the next, or was the good choice at the time. Do you feel that way?
Yeah, I always liken it to, and this has been the story of my life. I've been very fortunate that, like, as one door seemed to close behind me, and there was another door in front of me, I would open it, and there was the next opportunity. I never had a like a downtime or a void where I was sitting around wondering what's coming next. It all fell in place for me. And as I said, I had a lot of help along the way. And I think that the people that I interacted with embraced me because I was a little bit older. I wasn't a kid, and they realized that the passion that I had was genuine, and I always showed respect for other people, and as a result of that was respected, and people wanted to help me. And so as I look back, God, I met the who's who of and I went to Japan and went over there with a week early before a Japan tour, and it was one of those deals where they had a group of American players over there that were actually in Yokohama, and I went over a week early with Akio Sato, who handled American talent for Giant Baba, and met Sadaharu Oh, and the 500 home run club was a big deal because the number wasn't so many back in those days, and there was a counterpart 500 home run players from Japan, and they were all there, and it just was really meant a lot to me to be able to meet the great stars from Japanese baseball.
Yeah, well, that's just another bonus along the way. But where did this love really start for wrestling? Now, you mentioned that back in that time, there wasn't the opportunity where you could really follow baseball, and then of course your favorite team decides to move, more than a few thousand miles away. Is that what kind of filled the void, or was it something else that just grabbed your attention about it?
No, you hit the nail on the head. That was a turning point for me. I mean, I really liked baseball.
Yeah.
Everybody dreams of being a major leaguer, and I knew that I didn't have the skill level to ever do that, but that didn't mean I didn't love playing the game.
Yeah.
And so and living being from New Jersey, and then especially when I was working for Vince McMahon and met John Filippelli, and it's funny, like baseball, wrestling. A lot of wrestling fans are huge baseball fans, and when you interact with baseball players, most of them are huge wrestling fans. So it just it had a natural connection, right? Right from the very beginning, and
Yeah. That's amazing. Because, you mentioned that, and I'll just tell you a quick story because I keep coming back to baseball. But one of my first highlight films I did for the Twins, the Minnesota Twins. And I remember that I went there, and I was so, I was just this green kid. I didn't know what the hell I was doing with these shoots or anything, and I had all this responsibility. And I walked into the locker room, and Kent Herbeck, if you remember,
yes,
was with that team. There were these young kids, and Gary Gaetti, and it was just this really young group of kids. And they were wrestling full blown, all out, body slamming in the locker room. So it's been woven into my life as well. But
I had the pleasure of meeting Kirby Puckett too. Who was a huge wrestling fan.
Yeah.
And when I met him, it's like here I am in awe of meeting Kirby Puckett, and he thought it was a big deal to meet me, and I wanted to talk about baseball. He wanted to talk about wrestling. So that happens a lot.
Yeah. It's like rock stars. They do the same thing. Rock stars want to be wrestlers, and same thing. Movie stars want to be wrestlers. So the world's colliding, but it's all about entertainment. That's what it all comes down to. Sure. But I know that you're one of the first stars that you really followed in wrestling was Johnny Valentine, and you end up doing a fan club for him, right?
Yeah, I was 16 years old and had a fan club for Johnny Valentine, and I've got a picture on the wall of the basement of the Armory in Trenton, New Jersey, and John was walking out and had a picture taken with him. And I also befriended the original Zebra Kid, George Bolas, and he traveled the world, spent a lot of time in Europe, and he corresponded with me from all over the world. They used to have a thing, I don't know if they still have them, but it was like a 11 by 14 real thin paper, and it was blue, and you could write a letter on it, and then they had all the folds, and you would fold it up, and when you ended folding it up, it would be an address, and you would mail it. And then somebody could take it, and there were two places that you would slice, and the whole thing would open up. And it was a very inexpensive way, especially with international mail.
Really?
Yeah.
That's crazy how that. It's when we think back about how simple that way, snail mail, as they call it. Not even that's not even now to put. And imagine people putting stamps on things that, maybe with a thank you note today, but that's about it. But, you got, I guess, obsessed and we're going, and you're near Philadelphia in a sense, so you had a lot of access to the city. That's where you went most of the time, right? To watch?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Trenton, which was about 35 miles from Philly and about 65 miles from New York. So television-wise, we used to get the TV stations out of Philadelphia in Trenton and the TV stations out of New York. So we used to be able to watch the old Dodgers on Channel 9 with, like I say, Happy Felton's Not Whole Gang and watch. So that really was helpful in becoming a huge Brooklyn Dodger fan. And then, like I say, in 1958, they up and moved to the West Coast, as did the Giants. The only ones that stayed here were the Yankees. And it was, I was heartbroken because, again, before cable television, before the internet, and you'd run out and get the morning newspaper, and there'd be just a small line score from about the third inning when they went to press, and so it was hard to keep up. The interest, and that's when I kind of discovered, professional wrestling, and all of my attention and most of the focus of my attention went to wrestling, which worked out quite well for me as well.
Yeah, but you decided to go to college, and not to say that people didn't go to college back then, but there was as many people who went into trade jobs or didn't. What made you decide to go to college and you finished? You got a degree, and was it always the backup plan, or did you think, I want to get into the wrestling business? Why college?
Well, I befriended the original Zebra Kid, George Bolas, and they used to do TV in Philadelphia at the NBC studios in Walnut Street on a Wednesday night, and they would tape it and it would air on Saturday. So I was living I was going to college in Reading, and the guy who would set the ring up lived in Reading. And so I would drive down with him to Philly every week, and they stored the ring in the basement of the NBC studio. He would get it out, and I would help him. And the ring it was a scaled down ring. And in the basement they had which was actually a small movie theater, because there was a screen that could drop down from up above, and the seating was kind of like a theater where the seats kind of went up as it went further to the back, but it didn't seat all that many people. And the stage is where the ring was set up, and it would be set up right to the front of it just fit on the stage, and the front of it was almost up to the edge of the thing, so the guys had to know not to take a bump out through the ropes on that front side, because there'd be about anher 5-foot drop to the floor. So
it was a scaled down ring. It was a smaller ring.
A little bit smaller ring
for TV.
And the announcer would sit. I can't remember the guy's name. He was handicapped and walks with a limp, and he would sit there at a little desk right to the side of the ring, and the other guy that would set the ring up, and I would help him. We each wore a white T-shirt, and for the matches, he would take the jackets from one corner, I would take the jackets from the other. So at that time, I was in college, and it was like my 10 seconds of fame every week. Say, oh, there you look, you're on TV. It just was, God, it was some great memories. But like I say, I befriended a lot of these guys, because most of them that were traveling the East Coast circuit lived right across the river in Paulsboro, New Jersey, because it was accessible to go north and south because they would go up as far as the tip of New England up in Maine, and then they would go down to Washington, D.C., and they would go as far west as Pittsburgh. So in terms of major highways and whatever, so it was a great place to live and to really get to know all the stars of that era.
And they all came through there?
Yeah.
At one point or another?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. Because it was what was good was it was a lot of the other territories would have a major town, but that would be it. It would be a major town, and then smaller towns would fill out the circuit. But the East Coast had, Boston was a major town. Providence was a major town. Like Hartford, New Haven, they were major towns. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, down to Washington. So the top stars in the business eventually hope to be able to get their foot in there and come in, because the earning potential was so great because of all the major arenas in that area.
So did they? How did they divide the territories up then? I mean, we knew that Vince Sr. was there and basically ran New York, but how far did those territories run? Was Philadelphia different, something else that was carved out? How did they do that? And then, of course, we know that they would exchange talent. So how did it work?
There were probably 25 small promotions all across the country. Now, by small promotions, I mean like Florida would have been a territory in and of itself that would produce their TV. They would air in Tampa, and they had a circuit that, it would be like Tuesday was Tampa, Wednesday was Miami, Thursday was Jacksonville or whatever, or Tallahassee, and then Tallahassee. So, and these were weekly towns. And so in the televisions, it was produced in Florida and only seen in Florida. And it was only later on, I remember I was in Amarillo, and wrestling fans always, because wrestlers would come in and want to stay as long as they could. So I was fortunate that some guys, 5-6 months was their maximum, and it took me a little bit longer to get over, but then I could stay longer. Mm-hmm. And when you're having to move and change and get a new apartment and schools and everything, the moves were, and then you're having to reestablish yourself before you stop making, top money in the territory. So it was it's kind of a strange time in the business. And then when Georgia Championship Wrestling came on out of Atlanta and cable went on, I remember being in Amarillo at the time, and the fans in Amarillo would say to the Kozaks in Amarillo, when are we going to see Wildfire Tommy Rich and Buzz Sawyer? Because that's who they were seeing every week out of that Georgia TV, but they weren't in the town. They didn't understand
territories.
They didn't understand that you produced the TV for your territory, and that was virtually all the exposure and all the interest was built around. Now they've got something else, and they're saying, well, they never really rationalize, well, let's see, this guy's feuding with this guy. I mean, because that's what you had to do. You had to build up feuds and do finishes in the arena to build towards the following week, and then do something on TV to complement. And that's just how the business worked. Now all of a sudden they're seeing another TV other than the one that's produced locally out of Georgia. And I remember them used to say to the program, when are we going to see Wildfire Tommy Rich and Buzz Sawyer? And not understanding that, well, I don't have anything to do with them. They're doing their own TV over there, and they were running around Georgia, and they did go up as far as, I think, Columbus, Ohio back in those days. But that was the beginning of the change for television. And that's where Vince McMahon, I tip my hat to Vince, because he realized the direction of, and the other local promoters tried so desperately to hang on to what they had without realizing that they were becoming obsolete in time, and that it was only getting worse and not better.
Right.
And so Vince understood that he had to get his TV on in these other major markets so that he could become, and he really was the first, not only national promoter, but global promoter too, because he was going to England and going to throughout Europe.
Yeah, but before that, and the thing is, like you mentioned, I mean, it flipped everything. When cable came in and they were able to have these broader markets and cover more of the country, because prior to that, with the territories, you had your TV, but the TV was just for that viewing area. And you could have a guy have a run there, and let's say that might run 8 months, and then he could go somewhere completely different. Nobody'd seen him.
Nobody would
know. Now these were
know.
crossing over, and you would see these guys somewhere else, and then suddenly they show up here, but you've already, it didn't, things had to change. And it wasn't as though, you give full credit to Vince, and he deserves it, but it wasn't as though these other promoters didn't try and do the same thing. They just didn't pull it off because they wanted to do the same thing across the country.
They didn't want to take the risks because it involved financial. When you're traveling across the country and running live shows, then the transportation becomes, I mean, it just changes. It's not the simple thing that it once was, when you had a small geographic area and you were doing weekly towns, and you could do spot shows in high schools and all, but it radically changed the industry.
Yeah. Well, and the stories too, that Vince's idea with the syndication was he would go to these local stations, and back then we had them on videotape, and they would it would be a show, and they would send the thing out to air on that Saturday morning, whatever, and he was paying the stations to play it. He was buying airtime. It wasn't though they were, and that, I don't know how many times he almost went broke, or I think he did.
That radically changed the business, because up to that point it was a barter system. Yep. In other words, they would produce, like Tampa would produce a TV, and it would go to Miami, and so the TV station in Miami would get a complete 1 hour program that it was handed to. It would come on by bus on a 2-inch Scotch tape, and they would sometimes separately get. There would be like 6 2-minute commercial spots in an hour of television
that the station got to insert their spots.
The promotion kept 2, so that they would do the 2 event centers, like if it was in Miami, where they would, they would do the hard sell for what was in the, and if they didn't have a show in that market, they would fill it with something generic, and then the other 4 spots, the TV station would sell that, and that was so they're getting an hour of programming, and of the 6 hours
being paid to do that.
being paid to do it because of the six commercial spots.
Yeah.
They had 4 to sell advertising, and the nice part of it was that these shows were getting great ratings.
Yeah.
So
well, and you remember you remember Nelson Swegler.
Yes.
And well. Nelson, I had him on the show, and we got to talking about this same concept of how Vince was doing this, and he told the story of they're all in a meeting, and Nelson brings up the fact, he says, there's these other spots that we can use to put in there of our own advertisers. And he said, Vince said to him, we're not in the advertising business, we're in the wrestling business. And how much has that changed?
Well,
and I had to laugh.
And he was true, because it would not have had the same impact if they had filled all 6 2-minute commercials with live event centers.
Yeah.
If it was 4 of the ones that the station could sell to local, and it was getting good ratings, the wrestling show, so that was revenue for them. That here's a finished product, 6 television commercial spots. They're giving you the what to produce in the show for 2 of them, and the other 4 you can sell the advertising, and it's getting good ratings. So it was a win-win for the TV stations, because they got an hour show that they didn't have to do anything, and could sell the advertising at good rates because it got good ratings, and then the promotion had those 2 spots to hard sell whatever the live events were in that market. It was a great system and a great time in the business.
Yeah, it sure was. They would end up making a lot of money as advertising. I mean, Slim Jim and the rest, but that's another story. And before we get to your days at the WWF, WWE, I wanted to bring up, because one of your first jobs was a ref in the ring. And I was fascinated when you talk about it, because a lot of people don't understand how it worked back in the day. And I remember when we used to play the Garden in both Boston and New York, and when we went to Philadelphia, they were really strict about not only the unions that would, about the setting up rings and that kind of thing, but the athletic commission was
a big
was
part
very
of strong.
This. So explain how that worked, because it was it was just a payday for these guys, being able to help wrestling keep kayfabe or whatever. But for them, it was big money. So explain how that worked back then with the athletic commission.
Well, you had commissions, and like even in Pennsylvania, you had a commission that took care of half of the state to the east, and then a separate commission for the western part of the state out to Pittsburgh. And like you say, the referees, like in Philadelphia, with the referees, it was a thing where the commission referees often were not wrestling fans, and it was a political thing. In other words, as a political favor, they would say to somebody, I'll have you put on as a referee for wrestling, and you come down there and you make $100. Well, back in the 70s, $100 would be
a lot of money.
Would be a lot of money. Yeah, it would be somewhere between $500 to $1,000 today. So to have somebody say, well, you come down there and you don't have to do anything, you just got to be able to count 3. The problem was that once on a TV where they were wanted to do something on TV that was controversial, or because it's an athletic soap opera.
Yeah, like a hot finish.
Goes on weekly, and so they had some hot finishes. Well, these guys that were getting paid $100 just to be there and count 1, 2, 3, when it was all of a sudden somebody said, well, this is what we want to do tonight, and all of a sudden their eyes would get so
how are we going to get out of here? Yeah.
Like, what? Well, I was a wrestling fan, so for me, I didn't, I didn't care, and because I had befriended the wrestlers, they liked me because they knew that, well, if there's a hot finish, he's going to do it, and he's not going to be scared to death, and he's not going to turn around and look when he shouldn't, and kill the impact of the finish. And in return, they embraced me, and it was always like with a hot finish. Mm-hmm. They would tell me, we ahead of time that it's going to be, and especially a town like Philadelphia. You got a lot of Hispanic fans, and they were passionate. And sometimes you worried about them storming the ring, and then you also worried about getting from the ring back to the back of the arena where the dressing room was. And the guys used to say to me, they knew it was hot, and it was okay. And they would say, when we tell you to go. When you see the policeman coming up the aisle, when they're about halfway up the aisle, you go and then start. And no matter how crazy it gets or how much yelling or trash being thrown, do not stop. And do not look behind you. We will be behind you. Yeah. And if anything, we'll be pushing you, and they're coming to meet you from the other end. And all of those controversial finishes, all of those hot finishes, I think I got speared in the back with a chair one time that left a welt in my back. But other than that,
they took care of you.
They took care of me. Yeah. They took care of me because they realized that I was important to the business. And the next show, where the other referees that were just commission referees and were there for the payday didn't want to do it, didn't want to be involved in anything hot.
Well, they weren't going to help sell it either. But you mentioned police. They were it's some of those like riot squads, right? They weren't just cops hanging out. I mean, they would come out with the shields and.
But the other thing you got to remember too, a lot of these shows, the cops were local people. Yeah. They were there to protect you, but many of them were kind of fans too, and they're watching you, and you're doing something to basically, you've incited those people deliberately. That's what you're there to do. And now all of a sudden you're making my job difficult because I got to protect you. And so it was always a balancing act. And I always, made it a point, when I safely got to the back, I'd stop and, give each of the policemen a hug and thank them for taking care of me. In other words, it wasn't like I never took them for granted. And I genuinely appreciated that they took care of me. Yeah.
And, on the other side of this with the Athletic Commission, and JJ, you know it well, that, they set this up. It was the same the same procedure they did for boxing matches. So they would come, there would be a doctor that would have to see all the guys. And it was, and I don't know what the cost was. I don't know but that went on for years, right?
Yes. Yep, for sure.
I mean, I think that was part of the reason that finally Vince said, "Forget it. I'm not, to keep this up is ridiculous."
Yeah, but, they worked to abolish the commissions because the commissions they were having to pay a tax or a fee to the commissions. Yeah, right. So the promotion looked at that as an expense that did nothing to enhance the show. It was a political thing, and if they could somehow eliminate that was more revenue to be split other ways.
Yeah, and it was a pain in the ass for all the boys. And
it was.
I remember they used to have to line them up, and it was like, what a farce. But anyway, I just always was fascinated by that because, they ran it. It was just like it was, main event boxing, and it was like, come on, we're just trying to entertain people here. But that was a big part of your way you got started, though, is you were a great referee. You knew not to cross in front of that hard camera. So that
what happened was, like I say, I went to college. I went to Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania, and the guy who set the ring up, took it out of storage in the basement of the NBC thing, was from Reading, and so I knew him. So every Wednesday, I would then ride with him down early in the day to Philly. We'd get the ring out and set the ring up on the stage. And then, like I say, each of us would put on a plain T-shirt, and he would take the jacket from one corner. I would take it from the other. And then what happened was we went down there because we would leave early in the day to go down there because of having enough time to get the ring out of storage and set it up and so forth. And they had a weather front come through. We got down there kind of ahead of it, and we're actually in the studio ahead of the brunt of this storm hitting. Well, the storm hit really bad, and there was enough wrestlers that showed up to be able to put a 1-hour show together, but none of the commission referees showed up. And it was like, oh man, we don't have any referee. What are we going to do? And of course, everybody's eyes turned to me, and they said, well, okay, here, give me this. They gave me a striped shirt, and I ended up refereeing the entire hour because I was the only one there. And I instinctively, from being a fan, like I say, they didn't have to give me any instructions. I just instinctively knew what to do, knew not to. They made a point. And then whatever you do, just don't not walk in front of that. You walk 3 sides of the ring. Do not walk between the hard camera there and the back in the ring.
There you go.
We don't want to see your butt. and that's the only instructions that they really gave me. And of course, the boys all took care of me as far as whatever the finishes were. And I did the whole hour. They thought, God, wow, why have you been refereeing? So then they lobbied to get me added to the commission. And that's how it all grew from there. Yeah.
You know, in your book, wrestlers are like seagulls from McMahon to McMahon, and that it all makes sense. I mean, that's a quote, I guess, from Vince Senior, but he was around a lot then, and I think that you met him during that period of time.
Yes,
and then it would eventually go get trained. So
he would come to the big shows once a month in Philly.
Uh-huh.
They would either be at the arena in 46 and Market, or they would be at Convention Hall. And Vince Senior would come in, and I always remember he dressed, always with a shirt and tie and jacket, and usually wore a vest. And I always remember that he had, I don't know if they were half dollars or silver dollars, that he would have like 5 or 6 of them. It was like a nervous habit that he had a way of rolling them over. Back to front, back to front, back to front. It was like a nervous thing, and I remember he was a heavy smoker, but I got to know him on a first name basis, and he realized that I was there to help the business, and so because it was a commission assigned deal, I wasn't assigned to every show, and yet I would go down to the show and be there. In case somebody got hurt, something happened, and just because I was a wrestling fan too, and invariably the payoffs were done. The guys would get their advances, the talent from either Arnold Skolin or Angelo Savoldi, and even when I wasn't, when we refereed, we used to get $100. Now $100 back in those days was a lot of money, but I wouldn't be assigned to every show. But I would still be there, and invariably Skolin or Angelo would come over and shake my hand and palm me a $20 bill, and Vince wanted you to have this. Appreciates that you were here, just in case we need. Yeah, just showing up, just in case we needed something. And that was, $20 was back in those days was probably $100 today.
So we talk about this. You mentioned the doors opening. That was one, but I guess you had in your mind you always wanted to be a wrestler, and I think you ended up in Florida and started training with Graham.
I never really trained.
So how did you end up in Florida? Did you go there with the idea that I want to wrestle? How did you end up taking the stripes off and actually putting the tights on?
What happened was when I went to high school in New Jersey, and in New Jersey at that time, they had no amateur high school wrestling. I never saw an amateur wrestling match in New Jersey I went to high school between 60 and 64. And when I graduated, I went to Albright College because they had a wrestling team, and I went out for the wrestling team, never having even seen an amateur wrestling match. So it was like, your first tendency when you're wrestling is to want to turn and reach around, and you learn within 30 seconds, you're helping your opponent do what he's trying to do to you, which is to turn you on your back. So, that's a no-no. It's to stay on all fours and not get turned over. And so I learned the fun, and I went back I was befriended by the original Zebra Kid, George Bolus. And and I get asked this question today, and I know I ask the question a lot of times, George, I want to be a wrestler. Can you give me any advice? And his advice to me was, he said, wrestling will always be here. So before you worry about that, you first need to get your education and because the wrestling business can be very brutal. It's an athletic thing, and there's a possibility that you could be hurt on any given night and never be able to continue your wrestling career. So if you have that diploma in your back pocket, that's your insurance policy. So get your diploma, get that education, get that degree first, and while you're there, go out for the wrestling team and learn the fundamentals of amateur wrestling. Even if you've never wrestled before, you're going to learn, and you will be a better professional because you're now employing leverage and things that are integral to amateur wrestling, that if you incorporate that into your style as a professional, you'll be a more proficient professional. And he was absolutely true about that. So George Bolus had a very, very profound effect on me, and I took his advice. I went to a college that was not that far, 100 miles from Trenton, to go to Reading, and they had a wrestling team, and I went out, and they didn't have a heavyweight because it was a small school, and so I had to learn from scratch. Amateur experience, he was right, really helped me be a more polished professional. Because people say, well, amateur wrestling, professional, they're two separate things. Yeah, they are, but if you can incorporate like balance, leverage and things that are logic, there's balance. There's a lot of fans sitting there who have an appreciation for the fact that you don't do things that, if it was a real fight, there are certain things that you wouldn't do, and you learn from amateur experience what not to do, because you're always trying to protect yourself. You're always keeping from being turned on your back and what have you. And it ends up making you a better professional. So George was very, very right about that. And getting my degree was a smart thing to do. And I got good advice from good people. And then I made a lot of friends along the way. And so, I never was trained by anyone. And what happened was I refereed on television. And one time there was a bad storm and nobody showed up, and I had to referee the whole hour. And Ray Fabiani was there and said, boy, you're really good, and we need to get you on the commission staff, which he did. So now I'm starting to referee for the house shows. And then Willie Gilsenberg came and said to Ray, who's this good kid? He's really good. He said, he's a Jersey boy. He said, well, I got to talk to him and get him on the commission. We need somebody like him. He's really good. He just knows instinctively where to go. So, it just so much fell in place for me. And then
going to Florida.
I'm trying to think. Well, before I went there, it was like I was one day in the dressing room, and it was Eddie Farhat, the Sheik, came in for a series of matches to challenge Bruno, and just sitting in the dressing room making casual conversation, he said, yeah, you're really a good referee. You got good size and everything. And I said, well, he said, you could come work for me. I told him that my dream was that I really wanted to be a wrestler. And he said, well, you could come. I promote Detroit. You come work for me. And there was this silent pause for a couple seconds as I'm trying to digest what he just said. And I finally said, did you mean... because my parents, my father worked for General Motors, and they closed the plant down in Trenton, and he was moved to Detroit for the last 10 years before he retired. So they lived in Detroit. And he said, well, I promote in Detroit. You could come out and work for me. And I paused for a couple of seconds. You mean, I said, you mean come and referee for you? He said, no, you want to wrestle? We'll get your tights, come out, and we'll put you in the ring and see what you can do. Wow. And that's how it started. I worked. My first TV match was in Dayton, Ohio. It was a tag match against the Hells Angels. And then Saturday, Saturday I was supposed to be off. And then Sunday they did TVs up in Walled Lake, Michigan. So there was a guy named Johnny Carr from Springfield, Ohio, who was in Dayton that night. And he said, well, what are you doing tomorrow? And I said, well, I'm off tomorrow, but I'm working TV Sunday. He said, well, we have a carload that goes over to Pittsburgh because they need extras for their TV matches in Pittsburgh. And he said, you're welcome to get in the car and come with us. I can almost guarantee you're going to work.
Yeah.
Oh, hell yeah. So I went to Pittsburgh, Channel 11 on top of and of course I knew Bruno, though Bruno oftentimes wasn't a TV. It was Rudy Miller and Ace Freeman that took care of business. So I went over there, and that's how I got my foot in the door over there. And then when I saw Bruno,
because you've done a ton of matches with him before,
he really took,
right? As a rep.
Yeah, he said, "Oh my God," and then he wanted to do everything. That when I first went over there, I said, "Well, I know Bruno," and of course, Ace Freeman is, yeah, we've heard that story before, and I didn't, and I wrote Bruno a letter, and he had been in Italy, and so I didn't know he was in Italy, and I didn't get a response or hear back from him, and then they had a big show at the Civic Arena in Pittsburgh, so I went down to the show, and I went to the back thing, and I asked to see Ace Freeman, and Ace came out, and I said, I wrote Bruno a letter, didn't hear from him, but I hear he's here tonight, and I'd like to be able to say hello to him. Yeah. All right, kid, just stay here. So I don't know. Okay. All of a sudden, the door opens about 30 seconds later, and he's waving me, come on, hurry up. And I go inside, and Bruno embraced me like I was his long-lost brother that he hadn't seen for 10 years. And he then looked, and Ace Freeman has heard my story, but he's heard that story 100 times from people. But now his eyes are like what? Bruno does know you, and he's excited to see you. And then he looks at what's the name, and he said, I want him working this weekend. And he said, if you have to add a match, put him on the match. And Ace Freeman is looking, and it's like, yes, sir. and so they would run 3 times a week. They would run Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And so I worked there for every weekend for a year. And then I was going over to Detroit, and the Sheik put me on all his big shows, and then I'd work his TV too. So I was getting in-ring experience. And that's where I met Jim Grabmeyer, who was from Springfield, Ohio. He would work every summer for Crockett in the Carolinas, because they would increase their roster because they ran a lot of outdoor shows and what have you. And so when he came home, I got to know him, and the summer started, he goes to Charlotte, and 2 days later, I get a phone call, and he said, I'm down here in Charlotte, and he said but I'd been a heel, and he said, they're hurting for talent. And I said, well, I got this guy, I had your picture. So they looked at it, and they said, just based on my recommendation, he said, they'll book your sight unseen. And this is on a Friday night. And he said, you could be here Monday and start Monday. And I'm thinking, huh? And I've got a job, and it's and I had an old beat up Chevy, and I had never been below Richmond, Virginia, and Charlotte seemed like another planet. And they're saying, if you're here Monday in Charlotte, and I said, and of course all I said was, well, yeah, I'll be there. And I'm thinking, how am I going to get there? I've never been that far. And so, and then I remember I was afraid to burn a bridge there where I was working. So I gave the people that I was working for a letter. I put it under the station manager's door, the thing, and gave him 2 weeks notice. And knowing that I wasn't going to be there for 2 weeks, I was going to be in Charlotte on that Monday. And I drove through to Charlotte. You could stay at the YMCA in Charlotte for $15 a night. And it was right up the street on East Moorhead Street from where Jim Crockett Sr. had his office. And I went to Park Center on that Monday night, and drawing a blank, Anderson, the original Anderson, and they booked me with him. And it was the first match, and they said, 6-7 minutes, he'll go over, yes, sir, whatever. And I go out there, and it was a 20-minute time limit match, and all of a sudden I'm hearing 17 minutes, 18 minutes, only 2 minutes left, and the referee's saying, what are you doing? And so, they went into a finish, and Gene Anderson then sent word when the match was over. The referee came over to me, and he said, well, I know you're only supposed to go 6-8 minutes, but he said Gene could sense that you had talent, and he wanted to keep you out there and just seeing more and more what you were capable of doing. And the time limit almost ran out. So he said, you have passed the test with flying colors, my friend. And so I ended up, I stayed there for over 2 years, and I've had, like I say, I sound like a broken record, but I've been so lucky.
But the thing is, JJ, that I don't think a lot of people realize is that you did have, a pretty impressive wrestling career. Everybody remembers you for what you did as a manager, because, I mean, I know that you had a match at Madison Square Garden with Tito Santana for the Intercontinental Championship. Killer Kowalski is somebody. You could go on and on with all these guys that you matched up with, but I don't think people really know.
Yeah, when I first got booked, and I went to Dayton, and I was off Saturday, and they said, well, you can work tomorrow. We sent a carload over to Pittsburgh. So I went over to Pittsburgh, and I worked the TV match, which was my actual first single match, and it was Killer Kowalski. So it's a matter of pride for me to say, well, who'd you have your first single? Well, I actually had a tag match, my first match, but who was your first single match with?
Killer Kowalski. That's awesome.
And as I reflect back many a night where it was like, at that moment, it was the closest I thought I was coming to dying in the ring. And not that Walter he was not dangerous, but he was perpetual motion. He would start and he would knock you down, and then he used that stomach claw, and you'd take a bump and you'd be stunned from the bump, and just about the time you were ready to get some fresh oxygen in your lungs, wham, he clamped that claw. And it's, as I think back, God, I thought, am I going to survive this? And, he spoke very highly of me, because, that a lot of times those old timers, when they're wrestling somebody for an enhancement match and have no idea, they're going to be cautious. And so you have to, earn their trust. And, and I stayed there 2 years doing that. And then the Sheik, when he would run Cobo Hall or something, I would call the Sheik, and he'd say, yeah, put you on the card, come over and you can work the TVs too. So I was working back and forth between Pittsburgh and doing the big shows and TV for the Sheik. And then that's when I met Jim Grabmeyer. And I was there for over a year. Grabmeyer leaves to go to Charlotte. And all of a sudden I get the phone call. He said, well, I'm here in Charlotte, and they're hurting for talent. I had your picture and showed it to him. And they said, well, if you speak at the, have him come on down. He starts Monday. And I did. I packed everything. And I thought, well, you never know if another chance like this would come along. And it was so unexpected. So I packed everything I had. Like I say, never been south of Richmond, Virginia at that point. Drove all the way through to Charlotte, stayed at the YMCA, and I think I went to the office that day, and you parked behind it was in a residential street, and Crockett's office, you went in the driveway, and he had like an open parking area in the back, and then he had a long stairwell from the back of the building that went up 3 flights of stairs to where his office was on the third floor of the thing. And it just, they took a liking to me again. Sandy Scott was there, and they recognized right away that I wasn't a kid. I was a little bit older. I was like months from my 28th birthday, and now I'm starting as a full-time wrestler, like finally living my dream, and just never looked back from there.
And all that experience, because as I said, most people remember your time in front of the camera and being a wordsmith and just being great cutting promos, and then also what you did at ringside. But all that training, I mean, you could take a bump with the best of them, and I always talk about that people don't really appreciate what you guys could do in the ring. Someone like Bobby Heenan, he could take incredible bumps. And at what point did the manager, you say these doors open, when did that become something serious, and you said, you know what, maybe this is a good time to to take this opportunity, because I would imagine it'd have to be something big that would take you out of the ring.
Yeah, I finally had a chance to go to Florida, which was where I wanted to go and work for Eddie Graham. I heard, that he was this genius about the psychology of wrestling, and It's like I wanted to be under the Eddie Graham learning tree. So I finally was able to get booked. And when I went down there, the Mongolian Stomper was there, and he left Florida to go change territories to go to Tennessee, where he had a top spot, and with Bearcat Wright as his manager. And he wasn't gone, God, a week, 10 days. And all of a sudden I get a phone call, and it's Archie Goldie. And he said, this thing was was a disaster. He said, I should have known Bearcat Wright. There was no way it was going to work out, but it was worth the try. And he said, it's so bad that I had to do my own promos, and it just killed my gimmick. So he said, I can't stay in Tennessee. And he said, I've been on the phone. I've got a main event spot in Dallas for Fritz von Erich, where Red Bastien is Booker. And he said, but I don't have a manager. Have you ever thought about managing? I said, no, sure hadn't. And he said, well, we've got a top spot. I said, well, I'd have to get some. Back then, they had leisure suits were popular, and I said I'd have to spend a few bucks to get a couple things so I could. And so I went to Dallas, and that was the beginning. Never turned back.
Yeah, and boy, I've kept you an hour already, and there's still so much ground to cover here. But kind of fast forwarding where you would really start to be recognized as one of the premier wrestling managers out there, and it's not something that's anywhere near appreciated today, but it was a big part of selling storylines back then. And when you hooked up with Dusty later on, I think it was in '84 in Charlotte, and you started booking as well. Was this, kind of all coming together for you at the time?
Well, I wanted to go to Florida to be under the Eddie Graham learning tree. And when I went to Florida, I had never met Dusty. And he'd been up, I don't know where he'd been, but he came back to Florida, and he would move in and out. And I learned later that too much of Dusty was not a good thing. So Eddie Graham knew how to massage Dusty, that if before he would be there too long, that the glow would be off of it. Eddie would work with Vince McMahon Sr. and say, I need to move Dusty out of here for a couple of months. And then Vince would say, great, I can bring him up here. And he pops the Garden and the major towns. And Eddie would always approach Dusty with, Dusty, Mom, my good friend, Vince needs help, and you're the only one that could help him. So it's like he knew how to massage Dusty, so that he was fulfilling what was best for Eddie in the Florida career, but doing it in a way that he was selling it to Dusty, that that he was doing this for Dusty because they needed him so bad. And that almost sounds like, I don't know, but Dusty was a good talent. Sometimes the great talents can be their own worst enemies. They can stay too long or just wear out their welcome. And Eddie understood that Dusty was best when he would have a run, move him out for a while, and then bring him back, and he would come back in and explode it again. And so that they were able to trade Dusty off between Florida and New York. But going to Florida, Dusty came in, and I really got to be around Dusty and developed a friendship with him that, and I still think about, with sadness with his passing. But, with Michelle and Dusty became he became a close personal friend too.
Yeah, and there's so many people on the way that talk about how he helped them along in their careers.
Yes.
And, there's when people get in those positions and they're just incredibly talented people, and then you have that booking power, sometimes it can change. It can kind of cloud your judgment a little bit. And I think that there were some issues with that later on, but it got you along this road. I mean, now we're talking, you're getting to the big time in a sense. And I think it wasn't even with the NWA a year later that you're part of the Four Horsemen. So at this point in your life, what are you realizing this, or is it just like I mentioned, the train is rolling?
Yeah, I was in Florida, and I had worked early in my career in the Canadian Maritimes, and actually got my break up there as a heel, and I was the top heel for the summer, and it was the biggest year they ever had. And I came in, and that again, they had Killer Carl Krupp, they'd had Archie Goldie before that, and and I was got to know Leo Burke because he would come for the off season down in the summer for the Carolinas, because in the summer they would run up in the Maritimes, they would run hockey arenas, and the ice would be down in the summer, and that's when they would run. But in the winter, when they played hockey, that they would shut down. So they would then go to he would then go and to the Carolinas. So they saw me and they said, well, actually Weaver, they kind of like, they were friends with Weaver because they wanted to keep in. Weaver was it was Weaver and George Becker that were the top team, and then Johnny was like the booker. So Leo Burke and the Beast and those guys wanted to keep that relationship good with Weaver, so they would bring Weaver up to the Maritimes like for a week at a time and give him star status. They would bring him in like he was a great star, and John was a very talented guy. It wasn't like they were giving him something that he wasn't worthy of. And so one week he was supposed to go up there for a week, and one of the guys in Charlotte got hurt. I don't remember who it was, and one of the top guys. And so obviously Crockett said to Weaver, well, I need to keep you here because you weren't booked, but top guy got hurt, and so I need for you to take that. Now he's supposed to go up to the Maritimes. So they call me and they say, well, we want you to go up there for a week. Weaver can't go, and we know that you'll go up there, and we just know that you're not going to disappoint them. And I said, well, how am I going to get there? And they said, well, you come to the office and talk to Mr. Crockett. So I come to the office, and I sat there crossing that big table, and Crockett knew the whole story. He said, well, I understand, that John was supposed to go up there, but so-and-so got hurt. We need to keep John here. And so John wants to make sure that whoever goes up there doesn't disappoint them. And so he's handpicked you to go. And I said, oh, wow. And I remember it was like $680 for a ticket, round trip ticket to go up to Halifax.
Fortune then.
And I said, well, and I said, well, man, I'm flattered, but I said, I don't have the money to buy the ticket. And we said, well, you get your ticket. You'll go up there. They'll reimburse you for that ticket. So Jim Crockett goes in his pocket, gets out a big wad of bills, and he counts out, I think it was $660, $680 or whatever it has, and $100 tax. And he said, you go buy your ticket. When you get up there, he said, they'll reimburse you. And when you come back, you just come in and repay me. I said, well, geez, thank you very much. Because now that meant that I was my way to get up there. And I went up there and exceeded their expectations because they'd never heard of me. And then they said, oh, wow, we want you to come back next season. First, they wanted me to come back as they always had a single attraction. And then Freddie Sweetan was from there, and they would have a partner for Freddie that would be the tag champions underneath whoever the featured heel was. So they said, we want you to come in next year for the whole season as Freddie Sweetan's tag partner. Wow, this is my first break in the business. And Stan Stasiak was supposed to be the top single for that. And it was less than 2 weeks, might have been 10 days, around 2 weeks before Vince McMahon Sr. calls Stan Stasiak to give him a starting spot in the New York territory. Well, they set up there. We said, well, God, we can't tell Stan that he can't go because we're counting on him being here. They understood the business to know that you couldn't hold a guy back when he's got the chance to go work for the big promotion up there. So then I think in the car that day, I said to Leo Burke, I said, you know, you've had Archie Goldie, you've had Killer Carl Krupp, you've had all these big monster heels up there. I said, what if you change the formula 1 year? Because I'm tall, I look bigger in the ring than what I actually am, but I'm a braggadocious talking heel, a chicken shit heel. Totally different than everything that you've had. You've had the parade of monsters. And he's kind of listening. And so I rode with him the next day. And so I talked to Rudy, and I threw out, what we talked about. And all he said was, mm-hmm. And then didn't say anything more. I didn't say anything more. Then the next day, I'm with him again, and he says, John, they said, Rudy called back, and he said the more he thought about it, the more intrigued he was with the idea about going with a chicken shit wrestling heel rather than trying to find another monster. So he said, you were coming in anyway as a tag team partner. And he said, now, you're going to be the featured heel. He said, the only thing they're worried about is they wanted me to go start drinking a 6-pack every night and try to put on 10 or 20 pounds. Because I'm over 6 feet tall, but I'm about, 228, I wasn't 260. So, and so that was my break for a top spot, went up there, and it ended up, I had been making, I spent 2 years in Charlotte. My first year in Charlotte, I think I averaged $270 a week. Now, they didn't run on Sundays, and that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but you go back into the 70s, that 260 was like 750. Yeah. At the time, it was much bigger money than anybody could work on any regular job. And I went up to the Canadian Maritimes. It was 23 weeks, and they had their biggest season ever up there, and I averaged over $1,000 a week for 23 weeks. And it opened the door for me to go to Amarillo from there, where I was featured in, because they had seen me, and I was already set to go there, and told that I would get 2 tours of Japan, and it was like a momentum thing. And I had met Dory Funk was the reigning champion. So Dory, told me privately, he said, boy, he said, God, you would do so good in Amarillo. He said, but I got to be careful because I get in trouble if they think that I'm even talking to talent, and I wouldn't want you to up and leave abruptly, but when you're ready to make your move, I can guarantee you a top spot in Amarillo. And then they had a big show in Greensboro, and Dory was defending the world title, and Terry Funk and Dory Sr. came in on the same card for a tag match under Dory Funk defending the title. So Dory says, my brother's coming in and my father's coming in to Greensboro. I'd like for you to come down early and come to the hotel, and I'd like to introduce you and have them meet you. So I went down, got the phone call, and went down to Greensboro early. I went by the hotel and met Terry for the first time, met Senior for the first time. And when I left there and went to the Maritimes for the summer, I got the phone call. That's when Senior had died of a heart attack. So it was the only time I ever saw him and met him. And they just said, well, you're going up there for the summer, and we're telling you right now, you'll have a top spot when you're done there. Come to Amarillo, and we'll guarantee you that you'll have at least 2 trips to Japan for Giant Baba. So it just was a momentum thing. And
well, if anybody was ever wondering about your career as a wrestler, I mean, it's very rich. I mean, and you were a main liner, you're a main eventer, and but like you said, right place, right time, and a lot of these opportunities, and getting back to when we're talking about the formation of the Four Horsemen, was it?
Well, going back before that, I went to Florida as a wrestler, and Stomper left to go to Tennessee with Bearcat Wright as his manager. Didn't work out, so he calls me in Florida, and I was middle of the car. I was figured in there and finally happy to be there working for Eddie Graham, And he said, the thing didn't work out. I've got to leave here. I got to get out. And he said, I made a couple calls, and he said, I have a main event spot in Dallas with Fritz, and Red Bastien's the booker, but he said, I need a manager. And he said, have you ever thought of managing? I said, no. And he said, well, I've heard your interviews. I've worked with you. And he said, your interviews are unique. They're different. And he said, I think as a manager that you'd be, he said, I'd love to have you as a manager to go into Dallas, and we'd be going in with a main event spot. And I said, well, I need to call him. And he said, no. And so I had a starting date, went in, and that was the beginning. I mean, I went in on top with Stomper and then what happens is Stomper, and Stomper sometimes could be his own worst enemy. He had trouble with depression, and if some little thing would trigger him where he'd say, they don't really have any plans for me here. I mean, he would talk himself into what was a positive situation, and by the time he was done talking, he'd have you depressed. And it was so. His safety net was going back to Calgary, where he was originally from, got his break, and all he had to do was pick up the phone and get Stu on the phone, and Stu would have him booked the next day. So he could leave, and he was never like, well, if I leave here, where am I going to go? He called Stu, and he had a spot. So that's what happened. He wasn't happy. He leaves. So Red tells me, he said, well, Stomper just up, and they said we can't get a hold of him. So I said, well, I'll go by the house. And he had rented a house. I go by the house. I look in the window, empty, no furniture, nothing. So I called Red. I said, well,
I could be off here, but I think he's gone.
I said, he's gone. Oh, man, he said. And they already had this thing invested in me. And he said, well, first thing we want to make clear is we're going to figure out you're going to stay and you're figured in. And so the first thing that they brought in Lonnie Main out of San Francisco, Moondog Maine. And so I had a whole trail of guys that I managed, and it was the beginning of my managerial career out of Dallas. It was a whole new thing for me.
Yeah, see how this the road goes. You just keep following it.
Yeah.
And even as you guys are out there, as the legend goes, you come out for a promo with these guys, and Arn happens to say something that catches on, and now you got 2 rings.
Yeah, and that's how it happened. That I left and I'd gone back to Florida. Left Florida. Actually, I was hoping to someday, because when I started full time, I was almost 28 years old. So I knew that my years, going in the ring, were numbered. And so I knew that I had to learn the television production and the whole other facets of the business, and that I couldn't count on my career being able to make me a good living. And so that's what I did. I watched how television was produced, how a show was put together, and how everything was timed. So I became a student of the game. And Dusty came back to Florida, had a little bit of a run, and then I was going to go. I had an interest back in the Canadian Maritimes of wanting to be a promoter, having an interest. So they wanted me to come back up there, and offered me like 25 points of the promotion for no money, just me as a talent coming up there. And in the meantime, Emile Dupre, who used to run without television, and he never wanted to make the risk of being obligated to the expense of having to run the television every week. He, meanwhile, had taken over where the other promoter, where Rudy Kay had the TV, and he kind of got his feet wet. And so I wanted to go back up there, and Emil didn't want to step aside. So the TV station gave the promoter up there, they weren't going to give him the spot on the major television, but it was the first year for cable television in the Maritimes, so they were going to give the promoter that I'd worked for years ago, who'd been the announcer, they were going to give him a 1 hour spot on the infant cable network that was starting. So okay, and Eddie Graham had me gave me the full run of the tape libraries, and I did like 6 intro things that aired ahead of time. But I learned a lesson that cable being in its infancy, the whole thing is how many eyeballs are seeing you, and they had a great spot. It was a beginning, which if it had been 2 years later, it would have been entirely different. But it was cable television starting and had a very limited audience. There weren't enough eyeballs seeing it, and I was there a couple weeks. And the guy had given me a guarantee, and he owned an ad agency, and we could see that it was going nowhere because they didn't have the eyeballs for the TV. And I went to him and I said, look, I can't in good conscience take your guarantee money every week if cable television is just starting. If we had done this 2 years down the line, it would be a totally different story. And I said, I can't stay here and take your money. And I said, I don't want to see you lose your house and everything that you own to try and make this, when I can see the writing on the wall that we were 2 years too soon. And he thanked me. He said, there's other people that would have come up here and expect me to keep paying them, and what you say would have been true. So now I'm calling Dusty. I haven't even been gone 3 months. I called Dusty and I said, well, it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I was going to have an ownership in the thing, but cable television is just starting. And Dusty says, just stop right there. He said, I have just made a deal to go in and run. Jim Crockett is going to accelerate the thing, and he's going to run the Carolinas, and he's bringing me in as the booker. And he said, you're going to be with me. We're partners again. And I said, wow. And I said, do I need to call Jimmy Crockett? He said, nope. Pack your things, get in your car, and head for Charlotte. And he said, I will have a deal in place for you. And he said, you will be okay. Don't worry. I said, all right, Dream. And that's what I did. I left and went to Charlotte, and Dusty had worked it out for a decent guarantee to get me started. And that was the beginning of what ended up an incredible run. And then, like you say, Arn had been down in Pensacola, and he came in, and he did that one interview that we still talk about today, where he and they had put me with Tully and Ole initially, and so Arn came in and he did that thing on TV where he says, take a good look at your screen. He said, never have 4 guys monopolized the industry as we are now. He said, you'd have to look in your history books to try and find something comparable. And he said, you'd have to look at the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and held up 4 fingers. It was a throwaway line, because Arn always was thinking, and his interviews be different. So we go to Greensboro that night, and the whole first row of people were dressed with shirts and ties on, which I did then, and they're holding up the 4 fingers, and they're yelling, horseman.
Caught on.
And it was like a week to 2 went by, and Jimmy Crockett said, what's this 4 horsemen crap I keep hearing about? I said, I suggest that maybe you kind of embrace it, because I said, it's not something, it's a seed that Arn threw out there in that moment, and it had legs with the fans, and they're the ones running with it. They're the ones, and it's going to be successful because it's their idea. And he was true. It was true, and it just it took off and made history.
Turned into a forest. I mean, is it?
Oh, God,
it is. Yes. It's amazing. You look back, that as much even today, you see, the people, they see you guys as all the 4 fingers. I mean, it's there's nothing really in sports entertainment that there's maybe a few things, but that stand out more than that. All you have to do is hold up the 4 fingers, and I'm sure.
Yeah. And Arn, because Arn used to really think and try to have different interviews, and he said, take a look at these 4 people. He said, to try and find a comparison of anything that four people would totally dominate the industry they're in. He said you'd have to get away from wrestling and you'd have to go back to Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Held up four fingers, and that night in Greensboro, I remember, fans were yelling "Horsemen" and holding up four fingers. And from the ring, even if we couldn't hear them or didn't know who we were, we would just give the four finger sign back, and it just grew from there. I remember going to the Omni, and then we did an outdoor show, and there were like 60,000 people there. And I remember looking up, and you could just see the people holding their hands up, that it became something that they were a part of.
Well, and you mentioned, JJ, that it wasn't like you guys worked together all the time. You didn't have to. You were identified together. I think you called it a faction. Yes. But that you genuinely liked each other. I mean, you hung out. So it really was the Four Horsemen. I mean,
It was four guys who generally got along with each other, and to this day, Arn has become my closest friend in the business, and he called me the other day. We got a show coming up, and he texted me and he said, "I'm excited that I'm going to get to see you, so you and I can have some time together." I mean, it's just there's a.
It's hard to believe. I mean, it is after all these years, all these decades.
Yeah.
That they,
And in this business, you have business associations, and the number of really true friendships is a very small circle. And that was what was unique about the Horseman thing. That whether it's Arn, and especially with Tully, or with Barry too. When I was working Amarillo, and Mulligan and Murdoch bought the territory, and Barry was hauling the ring, wanted so bad to be a wrestler, and Jack would not hear of it. I mean, you couldn't even you didn't want to incur his wrath by even mentioning it. And so Barry used to tell me. And so one night, I think it was Fort Stockton. So I told Barry, I said, "It won't be advertised. Don't say anything to anybody, but bring your tights, and we'll have an opening match that's not advertised." And I went in, and you could tell from the first moment that we locked up that here's somebody, kind of like almost looking back myself when I started as a referee, that nobody ever trained me, but I saw so much that I mimicked what I was seeing and came across as being experienced and polished because I had seen it so often. And that's what happened there. And it was easier to ask Jack's forgiveness rather than ask him for permission if Barry could wrestle. And it was like after I thought, oh boy, I'm going to have to, I don't want to fight Jack, but and it was like, once it was done, Jack wasn't angry. He would never give his permission if you kept asking. But once it had happened, and it wasn't like saying positive things about somebody just because of who they were. He just was that talented. He was a natural talent. And Jack wasn't mad, and that was the beginning of Barry is probably as good. I can't think of anything better in my entire career. I've had 3,200 matches. I've been around the business for forever. And as far as a talent that had the size, had the youthful good looks, and had the ability in the ring to do anything and everything, I don't think there's anybody better than Barry Windham.
That's saying a lot. And there were quite a few other horsemen who stepped in here and there. What's the real story with why Ole didn't last in the Horsemen?
Ole, at the time, his son was a senior in high school and wrestling as an amateur. And Ole wanted to go to all of his high school meets to see his son wrestle. And so that's the reason that Ole wasn't there a lot. And so he ended up getting eased out of the thing. Arn came in, and it wasn't, there was no hard feelings because Ole was he was living his dream, seeing his son wrestle and being able to go and see him and not be hurting the promotion where he had made his living. So sometimes things just work out, and that's what happened in that case.
Had to think back after, but
and Ole was up in years, and when you looked at like with Flair doing the limousine riding, jet flying, kiss stealing, son of a gun, with the other guys, now even with me, it's like I could sit there with this like silly grin on my face that is like, okay, the old fart, he's loving hanging with the guys and being around the chicks. Only it didn't work. No matter how you tried to paint it, sell it, it just we buy the package, but
well, you mentioned Rick. I mean, my God, I can't even imagine what it must have been like to be around him every night.
God, yeah.
No sleep. Just constant partying and yet never missing a beat in the ring somehow.
No, just he's the greatest champion.
For a number of reasons,
I've seen, Luthez for 25 years was champion, but in terms of, the modern era, nobody better than Flair. I mean, he lived the gimmick, the robes, and when he was starting in the Carolinas, he hired the limousine and the driver. So he invested in his career and had the talent to live the persona up. And backed it all up. Yeah, he did. And again, I just right place, the right time. That was my, all these pieces came together, and I was always a part of it. And I say the luckiest guy in the world, and I really am.
As we mentioned, the McMahon to McMahon, and then and it's when we kind of met up back then, and with the WWF when you arrived. Was that another opportunity? Did you see it was time to go, or were you looking for it, or did it come to you? How did the arrival in the other completion of this life mission of yours to be involved with the McMahons? How did it come about?
Well, the thing
in '89
that Terry Garvin had been in working with Crockett, and I'd worked together. Terry ran towns, and so he and I worked very, very closely together. And he was close friends with Pat Patterson, and I met Pat one time when he came and visited with Terry. And of course, I'd heard about Pat and he and Stevens and all the records that they broke in California and up in Minneapolis, and he just had the reputation of being not only a great in-ring talent, but a great mind for the business too. And I'm trying to think of where I was going, but in terms of an opportunity up there, Vince was going to. Let's see, Crockett was selling the promotion, and so it was like everything was up in the air about what was going to happen to everybody. And this new company was buying the promotion, but they weren't wrestling people, and what was going to happen. So everybody was kind of looking for maybe an escape hatch if necessary. So Terry went up first, and he was going to go run towns. And so Terry would come to me and he'd say, they're looking at going the next step. And he said, your name is mentioned a lot. And he said, a lot of good things are being said about you. And they said, the thing is, though, because you're here, and I don't know if I had a contract that had run out, and I think it did. So I didn't actually have a contract. And he said, but they don't want to call you. You would have to call them. And that's how it happened. So one day, worth looking into. And so I called Terry one day, and Terry said, "Oh God, wait a minute, hold on. Let me go get Pat." He goes next to the next office, brings in. I hear the door slam. Pat's on the phone. And he said, "Oh, I hear so many great things about you. Looking forward to meeting you." And so it was right before the holidays, and I was going to to go up to New York with we weren't married yet. We were married that following year, but I was going up to New York and we were going to do shopping in New York City, and I was going to stay in Manhattan at the Marriott Marquis. So they said, well, Vince would like to personally meet you. And he said nobody in the office knows that there's been any conversation, because if the conversation didn't go anywhere, he doesn't want to jeopardize what you have in Atlanta by word getting out. And he said, so this is something that nobody in the office even knows. So I was at the Marriott Marquis, and I was told that a car would be sent in, a limo, pick me up, and not take me to the office, but take me to Vince's house.
Greenwich.
And I remember I got there, in Greenwich, a few minutes early, and Vince came in, finished his promos on TV, and didn't even have time to take the makeup off. Came in, sat down, and so he said that he wanted to offer me a job. And he said, but I'll be honest with you. He said, I'm not looking at you as an on-air talent. And I said, well, I don't have a problem with that to start with. He said, I've heard so many good things about your attention to detail, television production. Your background is so varied and complete in our industry. And he said, I would hire you for that, but with the understanding that I'm not looking for you to go on TV. I said, well, that's not a problem with me, because I've had my share of exposure in the limelight and the chance to come work for you and what have you. So he offered me, he said, and I said, the only thing is, my year before, I had my best year in the business, which back in those days, I made $220,000 that year, which with the salaries the guys make today is nothing compared. But back then, that was a lot of money. And I said, the only thing is, I said, I don't want to take, he said, as a salaried employee, he said, it's different than being a talent. I said, I understand that. But at the same time, I don't want to take a huge step back salary-wise. I've got to. So Vince said, okay, let me think about it. So I think Vince said, I made 220, and he said he was going to put me on salary with full benefits and everything for like 200,000. And it was before I got married, and we were living together. And I said, well, let me go home and run it by her. But I said, I'll give you an answer the next day. And I took the offer, which never looked back from, and which was very generous, very, very generous.
You had a good run. And how would you describe, though, your position? Because I remember you doing everything. I just remember you would be in, when we'd be doing interviews, you'd be in the box. You were talking to talent. You were running between Vince. I mean, how would you describe your position?
Well, I wasn't. It wasn't about a title. That wasn't important to me. And it's basically my body of work. I had done just about everything that you could possibly do, from put the ring up to refereeing to whatever. And I understood the makeup of a television show and producing a television show and being able to manage talent. I mean, not manage talent in the traditional manage on TV as a manager, but be able to handle a roster and deal with people, because they're it's like anything else.
All different.
And
know how to. It was like being
they're all different.
Baseball manager. You had to know all these personalities.
Yes. And the thing is, my background was so varied that really I had done it all. So no matter who I was talking to, I could relate to whatever their position was at that time, and I had walked a mile in their shoes. So I knew how to talk to them. I knew what they wanted to talk about and what was important to them. And so, timing-wise, it just all fell in place for me. And I keep saying I'm the luckiest guy in the face of the earth, but I really paid my dues, and it was the whole body of my work and the longevity that prepared me for that moment to be able to put in that position and make that kind of money.
You know, and I used to, what always amazed me about you guys that were, you know, I didn't mind revolving around that sun. That was nice, you know, to be a planet or a moon or Mooney out there. But you guys were like close as you could get. I mean, eventually you got to melt. I don't know how you could do it. But what was it like? Because I don't know if you were around Vince 24/7 like Pat and Bruce were on call at any time.
Yeah,
But was that the same thing for you? And how in the world did you balance that?
I was in the office, suit and tie, all week, and Vince was hands on. He did look at, you know, if it was a poster for a pay-per-view, he had to give his stamp of approval. So he would come in and out of meetings, but all of the creative was done on the weekends in his home in Greenwich. And so it was really a 7-day-a-week thing, but I was being paid good money, and got along with Pat, and Pat understood Vince.
Yeah, that's a secret
knew Vince's likes. He knew Vince's likes and dislikes, and so the things that he knew Vince didn't like, Pat would never allow that to be put out on the table because he said, Vince won't like that. We won't ever bring that up. And we knew what he did like, and I got along with Pat. I really did, and we would work. It was like when we would do back those days, we were doing three different television shows, and we were taping every third week and doing 3 days and doing 3 hours of TV and then a dark match. And it was like, it really was
those TV tapings. Oh my God. I mean, I don't know how anybody survived them, especially then you guys would get into, you know, we get in the jet and fly home, but then I think they went to the house too. I don't know when Vince McMahon ever slept and when you guys did either. It was Vince would he never asked anybody to do anything that he didn't do himself. And he would have a legal pad on his nightstand with a pencil, and he would wake up in the middle of the night, turn the light on, whether it was a dream or a thought that came to him, and for fear that he would forget about it in the morning or think it was just a dream, he would jot it on that tablet. And so he was really into the business and just a brilliant man with what he's done and where he's taken the business. And I got along with Vince, and we would work all day at his house. We'd be out by the pool, and I watched Stephanie grow up. Didn't see Shane that much because he was running around with his buddies, but Stephanie would be there with his girlfriend. Splashing in the pool, and we'd be under the cabana in case it rained, and you'd have a bank of balloons. And Pat and I had a great big ledger because we were running 3 towns a night, and it was frustrating at sometimes because we would do TV every third week, and we would have 3 blank sheets for the 3 weeks of TV that we were having to produce the next day, and we would start on a Saturday, and Vince, instead of getting those sheets and writing anything down, he would go to WrestleMania the following year that may be 10 months, 11 months away. And he wanted an idea in his own mind of what his main event was going to be for that WrestleMania. And then he would say, I could do this for Royal Rumble, I could do this for a challenge, whatever. And he wanted to back up from there, which was good strategic planning. The only thing in the wrestling business, if he had this great plan with Ultimate Warrior and all of a sudden the Warrior tries to hold him up at the Garden for money and Vince fires him, you might as well take that plan and just shred it. Now that was in a way frustrating that you would spend all that time for that long range plan that was susceptible to and you're worried about Monday.
Apart.
Crazy.
But we would do the TVs and we would book the towns, and you would have the main town, so you would have to have like 2 main events, and then your other town was like usually a B town and a C town, and then we would get them down, and then Vince would let Pat and I would have a roster with a list of, it was very well organized, and I learned a lot. I'd have a sheet with all the names of the heels, kind of in the approximate pecking order of importance, and and you'd be able to scratch talent out and place them, move people around. It was very structured, all thought out, and with people who had been in the business all their life, that like with Pat and myself, we could just make it work. And we had such a successful run in there. And the understanding was that Vince took credit for everything good, and no name never mentioned for anything that wasn't good. And we would have this big ledger with the things, and till we finally wrote things and changed things and moved stuff around. And invariably when we went to TV, Vince would sit in the front of the room, open his ledger, and then he would do the production meeting, presenting it as if everything came from him right there. And Pat and I would have our books in the back, and we had done all this together. And what would have happened, it didn't happen all that often, but sometimes things would change. Let's do them. We erase this and move somebody here. And Vince would forget to make the change in his book. Now he's up there starting to go. And all of a sudden I look at Pat. Pat looks at me, and I raise my hand in the back of the room. Yesterday, I said, Vince, I have a note here that I think you changed your mind and said that you wanted to do this. Yes, I forgot. You're right.
You know how to present it.
That was my thinking. I didn't write it down. It was still Vince's idea coming from him.
Oh, that was very diplomatically handled.
And because we weren't there it wasn't there about trying to send the message to all these people. Well, you all think it's Vince, but we didn't have that. We were paid well, and the system worked well, and we didn't need to send the impression that somehow that we were such an important part of it.
Yeah, it was amazing how they put that all together. And as I mentioned, you're revolving around the son, which is Vince, and eventually it's too much. I don't know how Pat lasted for as many years as he has, and Bruce is back. But what was it? I mean, was it to a point where it was it was too much? Because, like you said, Vince doesn't expect anybody to do anything he doesn't do, but he's a maniac as far as his work ethic.
Yep.
So
he's 24/7.
Was it just too much, or what finally did it come down to?
I call it the 7-year itch. And you hear about it in personal relationships that they get together, and after 7 years, they just get so tired of each other or something that what you were tolerating during this thing of 7 years reaches a point where it's not tolerable anymore.
It's too much.
And I think with Vince, it was the same way.
Really?
I was there 7 years, and it just reaches a point where, and your family gives up a lot because you're in the office all week. And I didn't have to go. I only went to the garden, and but if we didn't have the garden, we worked at the house on weekends, and very seldom. And a lot of times didn't know, you couldn't plan anything. Right. And Pat had Louis at the time, who was still living, and so Pat didn't have a life. I had a family, and I wanted to be. Lindsay and I got married, but while I was there, but I wanted to be with. I wanted time with her. I wanted some kind of balance in my life. Pat didn't have that same need because he had Louis, and they'd been together 25 years, and his personal situation was different than mine, and I was willing to work all week, work on weekends, but then I did want some time with my family, and that sometimes was a struggle to be able to get that time. And my wife was very understanding. We did well financially. I was, like I say, Vince had a jet, and very few people flew on it, but I was one of them. And Vince would have it catered with with shrimp and lobster, and I mean those things not as important to me, but at the time it's nice that because you're working so hard and there are some sacrifices with your family. So these were some of the little things that Vince wanted it for Vince, but he also wanted you to be included because that was a way of kind of doing something for you too, that to show his appreciation for how hard you worked.
So when you left, was it a conversation with Vince? Did you tell him, I just can't do this anymore? How did it end with you two?
He brought in a girl. He brought in one of the girls. She was a woman she was in charge. She, in the pecking chain, she was actually, I was an executive vice president, but she was above me and I reported to her. And her two brothers were connected with the NFL. And so she was a player. And we would go to the hotel on the road, and of course she'd be on the hotel too. And then we'd go up there to check in, and I want a room right next to JJ, and it's like, yeah, and nothing ever happened, but it was the perception of what might be going on that you know where I'm going. It just, and it kind of at times made me uncomfortable, but she was my boss, and I would, like, if we would go to a TV in Baltimore, we would drive Baltimore. She had a flat in Manhattan, so she'd say, "Well, I want you to come in and pick me up, and I want to drive with you." I'd say, "Okay." So I would go into Manhattan, pick her up, and she would come out, and I had a sweet tooth, and she had a bag with all these candies that I liked, and she'd put them in the middle of the console, and
you felt harassed.
It just
it works both ways. It can happen.
I don't want to say harassed is maybe too strong a word, but
it was enough. It was enough.
Yeah, it was enough that I wasn't comfortable, and it was like, I think Vince and Pat, it's like if you see somebody that steps on a hot pavement and has to dance because their feet are burning, I think Vince and Pat could see what was going on. And she was an older woman, and Lindsay was 13 years younger than me. I had a young wife, really good looking woman. And so they enjoyed watching me having to try and watching me squirm around what was obviously somebody with her. We check in. Make sure my room is next to JJ, and Pat and Vince would look and roll their eyes, a little smirk, and I'd have to just sit there with a straight face,
But it also sounds like you were ready at that point. Is that true?
Yeah, after 7 years, and I don't remember what. Part of what happened was the legal thing, and everybody's salaries were cut for a period of time, and so that was and the salary was eventually restored, but and after 7 years, it's like, I ended up going to Atlanta, and I had the exact same position. I was executive vice president of talent relations, and basically I went for the same money, maybe even a little bit more money, and ended up staying there 7 years. So I've had a great career. I remember when I went to Dusty's memorial service after Dusty passed, who, God, he was close. For me, and a
lot of people,
and that was a tough one. And I was sitting there, Flair and Flair's wife, and I was sitting in the thing, and in comes Vince, Linda, Shane, and Stephanie, and they sat in the row right in front of us. And then I don't know if it was the break or when the thing was over, and Vince is out And, of course, everybody wanted to have their moment, talk to Vince. And I walked outside, and all of a sudden Vince turned around and saw me and made eye contact, and it's like, JJ! And,
like yesterday,
it's like,
yeah,
two old brothers that hadn't seen each other, and family reunion, and it was like, it was that corny, running up, and he hugged me and I hugged him, and God, Vince, how you doing? God, you look great. Yeah, you look great. How's things? Everything's going good, and so I left with no bad feelings, no ill will, and I call it the 7-year itch. I think best of times, because of the demands that the business has on you and demands on your personal life, it's hard because you can't do it part-time, or you can't do it halfway.
You've got to be all in.
It's 24/7 and consumes your whole life. It's all in. And to be successful, that's the commitment that you have to make. And knowing where I came from and my history in the business, all of a sudden, I'm a top executive for the greatest player in the business that's a global thing. I mean, people would have died to have my position. And I never was, it wasn't an ego thing with me, or I never went to my head. Trust me, never went to my head.
I'm sure many people would say that. Before we wrap up here, I've got a few questions that our listeners sent to me, so I'll rattle them off real quick. Ethan Fisher says, out of the crop of talent in today's wrestling world, can you comprise a modern version of the Four Horsemen?
Boy, Ethan, I get asked that question a lot. And to be honest with you, I don't watch the current product. I'll go by. I don't sit down with a set time to watch it, and I'll watch a little of it. And so I'm not familiar with who all the current players are. So having said that, I couldn't look at the whole roster and say, this, if I would had to put together a Four Horsemen thing, these are the guys I would pick. And to be honest, I don't know that there's anybody at any time other than the time that it originally happened that you could find four people, me being the fifth, four people who personally got along, personally on top of their game, that got along with each other. It's like that happens maybe once in your whole career. And I was lucky to have it happen and have it last as long as it did. A lot of times the pressure of being in that spot, and there's people that don't want to see you succeed for whatever the reason. And, I would go see Ole a couple of times. I would go, and Ole was in the office when I started with Crockett in '71. He was a top guy, he and Gene. So that's how far back my friendship goes. And a lot of guys don't understand Ole. I understood Ole, and I could be around him and laugh. And it's been going back and forth with Arn because we got something coming up, and he's excited that we're going to see each other and have some time to spend with each other. And it's with Barry and with Tully, the Horseman thing is something that there's substance to it, that you could not have taken that and say, well, we're going to create. Arn happened to name us, so we got to give him credit for that. But to take four guys and put together, you couldn't replicate it today.
The planets lined up at the right time for that.
Yeah. Yes, that says it all. And somebody says to me, well, the roster today, my mind can't even go there.
Like you said, it's not even talent. I mean, talent was certainly part of it, but I mean, there was just all this other, factors that involved with that.
Yes.
The way that people identified with it, that it took off.
Yeah, that comes along sometimes never in a career, and in my case, maybe once in a career, and that's why it had longevity as long as it did. And I sometimes, this is now 20, this is like 30 years, 88, 98, 08, it's over 30 years. And I get calls to go to independent shows or a fan fest and advertise that I'm going to be there to pose for whoever the fans come. They're paying me to come there, paying my expenses, paying my hotel, paying, and fans. It's still in
I've
their
been
memory.
there, JJ. I've been at these shows. I've seen the crowds that line up for you guys. It's just amazing to me, and young people too. It's not just these are old, fans from the '80s or
I can't count the number of times where a guy will come up to get something signed with his young son. And the son's looking at his father, looking at me, has no idea who I am.
But a lot of them do because they're able to go back and see this stuff now. And it's,
Yeah. But a lot of times the father would say, when I was your age, my father took me to see him. And when I did, I hated your guts.
What a compliment.
And I chuckle when they say it. And I say,
my job.
Wow. I said, maybe I was pretty good at what I did then.
Yeah.
We laugh about it, and it's not a personal thing. But
all right, here's a great question. Also from Ethan, he says, also in your opinion, why is wrestling not using as many managers anymore? And that is something that I don't understand either.
Well, when you think back, it was more the territory days and rather than a national network.
We had some great ones that really helped.
Yeah, Bobby Heenan to me is, I look at him as the greatest manager of all time, and he's the one that sets the bar by which all the rest of us are judged about how did we begin to become close to being what Bobby Heenan was. He was everything, and he was a great in-ring talent. I was with Bockwinkel at Cauliflower Alley one time, and Bobby's name came up, and he said, when Bockwinkel and Stevens were so strong, both in California and Minneapolis, and he said, if one of us had an injury or some personal thing they couldn't be there, Bobby could step with his tights on and be as good, if not better, than either of us, whichever one he was replacing. And I thought, wow, that's an unbelievable compliment coming from the likes of Bockwinkel. And it's just that's how good Bobby was, and that's why, I say with as much humility as I can possibly put together that Bobby's the greatest of all time and sets the bar by which the rest of us are judged. And if I came even remotely close to him, that's a great accomplishment for me. Something to be proud of.
Says, what are your thoughts on NWA Power so far? I don't, like you said, you're not, you haven't been watching the current product, but they're returning to having these studio shows. I don't know if you've heard about it, but what do you think of that idea? And he says, do you think it would have been a better idea to have an updated, fresher-looking, smaller venue to hold these events? Have you heard about that NWA Power is doing these studio shows again?
Yeah, I saw the comments, but I haven't had a chance to watch a couple episodes to be able to make a judgment. But there is nothing original in the wrestling business, nothing. And it's like it went. Studio wrestling was big. It was intimate. There was like the TBS studio only had, I think, seats on two sides of the ring and only like maybe two rows. And even in Tampa, they would have like a bleacher, but it was only two rows of bleacher, and they had faces of people painted on the walls. It was a small, intimate crowd. It just
I don't know if it can work today, though.
What it comes down to is the product in the ring is really how you showcase it and how you put it out there. The product, nothing replaces the quality of the actual product in the ring and the players. And you can disguise it any way you want, but that's what it comes down to. You can't fool people and make them like something that they've got to like it, and it's got to be genuine.
All right, and the last one here is from Jared England, who says, and I don't know how you're going to answer this one, which member of the Four Horsemen was your favorite to manage?
Oh, wow. I give this answer all the time, and it sounds like a cop-out answer, and I guess it is. I love them all because I made money with every one of them. And
Flair, though, just because
I enjoyed being around. Yeah, being around with Flair, I had, and everybody's personalities were different. Like Tully is different, Arn's different, Barry's different, Flair's different. Yet we can all be together, and it's not like somebody's uncomfortable being around the other three. We can be together, or I can be individually with all of them. I'm probably a little bit closer to Arn than any of the others, and I don't know. It's just happened over a period of time. He's somebody who, man, he came up from Pensacola, and he, with his interviews and what he's done in the ring, has had, if you just saw his picture, it wouldn't jump out at you and you would say, oh, you see other guys with their pose and everything. But Arn is everything. He is, if you were going to clone somebody and give him the qualities to do everything, he can interview. And his interview, as we've already pointed out, his interviews are because he gives a lot of thought. I can do an interview where I don't have to think ahead of time. And I know what, all I need to know is it a 30-second, a 45, 2 minutes? And what are we selling? Or what's the bullet points? Are we selling an issue or with somebody? Is it next week's TV? Is it a big show coming up? And I know how to incorporate all of that, whatever we're trying to accomplish. And because I've done it so long and I know how to go about doing it in my own style. But the Horsemen it's something that will often be imitated, and you hear this many times, but will never be duplicated. It never will. And though Flair is the most flamboyant of the group, Tully in his own way is a great talent. And Arn is, God, he's the guy that with the passing of time, you've seen his true value come to light. And he's a guy that he's still married to the same woman. He's got a son he's putting through college. He has put so much into the business, and every bit of success that he's had, he deserves, because he's a great guy. He's a personal friend. And I feel fortunate that I was the right place, the right time to be part of the Horsemen, to be friends with Flair, to be friends with Barry, to be friends with Tully. But my friendship with Arn, I call him he's the brother that I never had.
And my last question, JJ, as we wrap up here, and one thing I really like about the WWE Hall of Fame is that they're not celebrating just time spent with the WWF, WWE. They're celebrating accomplished careers, and it's full circle when I think you guys stand on that stage. And so with that in mind, what did it mean to you to be inducted?
It meant a lot, because you get accolades for what you've done, and I don't want to sound corny, but I am by nature a humble person, and I am thankful. And when I do interviews in the ring, the last thing that I always try to say is to point to the fans that are sitting there, and to say that my success was not because I was the biggest, the best, because I wasn't. I was surrounded, because a lot of times the Horsemen would be in the other corner, and I was blessed to be able to be around guys. But I said, the ultimate judge and jury for all of it is you people sitting out here, because you're the people who saw us, that there was something that we had that garnered your attention, and that you people work hard for your money, and that you were willing to spend the money to come see us. So it's you that I salute, who have supported professional wrestling, have supported the Four Horsemen, and have supported me for my entire career.
Well, that's fantastic. And JJ, really, it's been awesome chatting with you. It's been a long time since we really got a chance to sit down and chat. And I hope we can catch up on those baseball stories next time we see each other. Let's have a beer, and I've got some great ones to tell you. But I know you got some other things going on, and you got another podcast happening. How can folks tune in to this version of the J.J. Dillon Show?
Yeah, it's on at 6:05
on Saturdays,
and
yeah.
On Saturdays, and I think it's the Major League Wrestling Network. We've been doing it for just a couple weeks, and the feedback has been excellent from what I'm told. I've never listened to my own podcast, and I don't listen to other podcasts. So I don't know if it's good or bad, but I am by nature a storyteller, and people who have commented, the things that stick out to me that make me feel good are, we like that when you do your podcasts or any kind of an interview, you're not an angry person. It's not like,
you're not,
you've had all the success. You have nothing to be angry about. But a lot of people in this industry, when they do an interview, are angry about something or somebody or whatever, and you're not. And that I don't use colorful language. I don't swear. I don't swear at home. So why would I do it on an interview? It'd be totally unlike me. And as a kid, 16 years old, I fell in love with wrestling, and I've had an unbelievable career that just one thing fell in place for me after the other. And now all of a sudden, I'm in my 70s, and I've got 2 Hall of Fame rings, and I still get asked to go and appear at shows and fan fests and things. And I still love getting out with the people and hearing their stories about what their memories are of me. If we had met before or hadn't, it never gets old, never gets tired.
Well, JJ, thank you so much for coming on Primetime.
Thank you. I've enjoyed Primetime.